The following is a Shaw Public Affairs presentation.
There probably isn't another job in the world except being a BC MLA in the legislature where you work 24 days a year. Most British Columbians would sit there and think, man, how could I get one of those jobs, particularly for $100,000 a year plus benefits and pension.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and it's been a while since we've done one of these on Voice of BC. The media panel tonight. Welcome to the show, Justine Hunter. Thanks for being on. And welcome to the show. Welcome back, Keith Baldrey.
Always good to be here.
So we're going to talk about BC politics, but it being the day after the big game and the big riot, we're going to start off talking about the big riot. What do we say about this thing, Justine?
Well, I think the question is going to be, can Vancouver have these kind of big public events downtown where you've got 100,000 people invited downtown in an unstructured way, right? They're not in an event, not any contained area where they can control the crowd, and say, come on down and celebrate. And I think people thought during the Olympics that happened, and it was a good event by and large. People were happy and enjoying it. It was a family-oriented event. And I think what we saw this week was quite a different event, and I think it's going to make people think twice about whether or not Vancouver can handle these kind of events.
Although Vancouver also hosts the fireworks every night, there's 300,000 people, I think, down in English Bay down there. I've been there a few years ago. Again, it's not the same atmosphere. The Olympics, again, a different type of crowd. The fireworks, I think, have a different type of crowd. This one, the hockey crowd, the Vancouver Canuck fans, there's a contingent of them, and we saw it in 1994, that I think people last night, after the game, rightly predicted that this was going to lead to trouble.
You just can't handle losing?
I don't know. I don't think it's diehard hockey fans. I think you have to factor in the fact, I noticed this early on yesterday on the internet, the shots of people lined up, hundreds of people lined up to get into bars at 10 o'clock in the morning. And that's when they start drinking, because they wanted seats, guaranteed seats to watch the game. So I would say there would have to be at least 1,000 people who sat in downtown Vancouver yesterday in a bar drinking alcohol for hours and then come out at 8 o'clock. And I don't think it's necessarily surprised to see the combination of some troublemakers and some drunk young people, most of them male.
I know, Justine, you spent some time today researching the 1994. What are the differences?
Well, in 1994, I think the police really were caught off guard. They weren't prepared. Their radio communication didn't work. You know, you had people calling in dispatch and not being able to raise their command, so they're sort of wandering around without controls. I don't think we won't see for probably months until we get into the review that will inevitably come tonight. But I think they were probably a better organized police response. But it still was overwhelmed, and they still, at the end of the day, couldn't contain this crowd. I don't think, there are some big parallels. I think there was a lot of young, particularly males. If you look at the sort of the demographic of who was down there, the people that were arrested in 1994, most of them, the average age was 19 or 20. Mostly male, mostly from outside of Vancouver. So a lot of people coming in from the suburbs. I know there was thousands of people coming off Vancouver Island, clogging up the ferries, people coming from the interior. So big crowds came down to party, and I think that was very similar. And you saw some of the same problems where you had people congested, couldn't get out. I was getting alerts all last night from the transit people saying we're trying to move crowds out of Vancouver, out of downtown. Couldn't even get buses in.
And a big difference, though, from 94, and we saw it play out today, and the Vancouver police now using this as an investigative tool, social media. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of pictures and videos now on the internet and exchanging with people. Newsrooms have been inundated with citizen journalists, as they like to call themselves, photos and videos of individuals who are easily identified now. That was not the case in 94, where you had this mass ability to identify everybody who's engaged in wrongdoing. There's relatively few people. Jim Chu says a bunch of anarchists. Well, the anarchists we know who almost professional protesters at the Olympic Games and the like, they wear masks and balaclavas because they know they don't want to be identified. The people last night, a lot of the drunks were just openly known and not wearing any disguise, and I think they're going to discover to their horror that they're going to be identified by people, and then probably their names will be passed on to the police.
Well, people get into a
there'll be
group
any
like
criminal
this.
charges in it?
I think there will be. I mean, I think there were over 100 people pleaded guilty in 1994, and we now have a huge ability to collect evidence.
What
there
kind of
was
sentences in 94?
Well, I haven't been able to get a sense of whether or not, because I heard the Premier this morning talking about, well, we need to really come down on these people and make sure we, uphold the law and make sure we go after these people and let their employers know and their family know that they were involved. And I was asking around for statistics, and nobody's been able to get them to me yet. The one thing is the London drugs. They went in and looted London drugs, and they said we have crystal clear images on our security cameras of 200 people walking, emptying the shelves, electronics, perfume, you name it. And people weren't covered up. They weren't ashamed, And so you've got this group think of people just sort of in a herd of people, and they just aren't thinking clearly. They're not thinking about the consequences. They think they're invisible, and I think
we'll
this
see how
time
many
they're
people
not.
lose their jobs as well. It's not just criminal. It's interesting, Christy Clark, the Premier, said want their employers to find out who these people are. And I think already anecdotally we're hearing of some instances of people who are losing their jobs because they've been identified by their employer quite clearly in images on Facebook sites. People are bragging about their exploits. Careful what you put on Facebook. It's not anonymous, and if this stuff gets back to employers, I think a number of people may lose their livelihood.
Do you think we'll see a change in how these things are done in the future? Assuming the team ever makes it this far.
I wonder, first of all, there's going to be some changes on alcohol. Closing the liquor stores at 4 o'clock obviously didn't have any impact or minimal impact. Allowing people to sit downtown and drink all day long and then going out into the streets, I think is probably one area they're going to have to look at. And I'd be surprised if there's going to be this organized nightly event with Canucks games. Come on down to the CBC Plaza and have 100,000 people. I don't think we're going to see that organized type event again associated with the Canucks, but I still think we're going to see big events like the Fireworks Festival.
Premier Clark, Justine, certainly climbed on the bandwagon fairly early on with the Canucks, did the Jersey Girl picture that's famous to everyone. Do you think it helped her at all politically, or do you think there's a bit of a backlash against her for it? I
think she, I don't know, I saw her in the jersey maybe one too many times for myself, but I think it was part of her populist appeal to go out and say, hey, I really am into hockey just like you. Lots of people were climbing on that bandwagon. And it didn't come across as entirely phony, when you see a politician sort of putting on a cowboy hat or putting on a hockey jersey, whatever, and they look stiff and uncomfortable, and you say, I can't imagine them doing that if there wasn't a television camera around. I don't think she came across that way. However, obviously right now the Canucks, through no fault of their own, there's a bit of a black eye associated with this big party and the bandwagon effect. So I don't think it's going to hurt her in the long run.
Should she have taken the 2 free tickets to the last game?
I don't have a problem with that. I mean, she's the Premier of the province. The Premier goes to a lot of events and should be seen at a lot of events. I don't think it's... there's so many people get free tickets to Canuck games. So corporations hand out those corporate boxes all through Rogers Arena. They each have 20 or 30 seats, I think, in them. I know a lot of people who got, in the media business, who got free tickets from corporations. So, no, I think she's the Premier, and I think, just like the Prime Minister, I think should have tickets as well.
We could probably do the entire show on this, since I think everyone in British Columbia is still digesting what happened last night, particularly if they saw the images, which were not just on social media, but were on regular media as well. I want to take a quick look at the latest opinion poll that's come out. And we've been talking about polls a lot, partly because we think an election's coming, partly because we've got this referendum as well on the harmonized sales tax. So let's take a look at the, this is Ipsos Reid, and this is, I think this one came out in the last week. So let's see what the numbers are from Ipsos. I think it's 44% of British Columbians want to extinguish the HST, and 38% say keep it. I think that's the number, right?
It depends on whether you look at, if you look at just decided voters, at the last Ipsos, it was about an 8-point spread, 46-54. But that's including people that are.
Unfortunately, that poll right there is a lot clearer to many people than the question. Scrap versus keep is easier understood than extinguishment and revert back to the old tax.
Well, that poll
55% are confused. I think when people actually take the time to read the question, that number should go down. But it is an oddly phrased question. But as you pointed out in your column today, Vaughn, the origins of this ironically stem with Mr. Bill Van der Zand.
Yeah, he introduced the word extinguishment into this, and when they wrote the question, they felt they had to preserve that.
Sure, and I think what we've seen is, you think of the incredible gap last fall. It was like 85% of the province said, no way, we don't want this HST. So the gap has been closing. But right now, assuming that this postal strike wraps up fairly quickly and people get their ballots and are able to send them in, really the campaign is this week and next week to win people over. So I don't think right now they're close enough for the government to win this. I think if they were actually having a vote today, obviously it would be lost. But I think it's it's really going to depend on how many people are motivated.
That's on July 22nd.
People have till the 22nd, but
4 o'clock.
Basically the blitz is to get the vote out is the next couple of weeks.
Well, you liken it to an election campaign where the get the vote out strategy is confined to one day only, 12 hours. You identify your vote and you get into the polls. In this case, both sides have the opportunity over a period of several weeks to identify their voters and get them to the polls. I still think the motivation rests more with those who are opposed to the HST than those who are in favor of it. A lot of people I know are in favor of the HST, but they don't seem to get worked up to the point of actually voting in favor.
I think we've got a poll on party preference from Ipsos as well, so let's see if we can get that one up, because it's just, it basically, my recollection is, it shows the same sort of thing we've seen. We've seen this now for a couple of months, which is basically the two parties so close that the margin of error is bigger than the gap between.
It's a statistical dead heat. I don't expect those numbers to change much in the months or years leading up to the next election. That 41-39%, as a matter of fact, was the same result in 1996, where the Liberals had 41%, a little more than 41%. The NDP had a little more than 39%, but the NDP won the election because they had more seats, because the Reform Party and the PDA drew more votes away from the Liberals and allowed the NDP to squeak through. So if the Conservatives can hang on to their standing in these polls, maybe we're seeing the same scenario develop.
It's going to be close.
It's going to be close, and you're thinking Christy Clark is getting her party ready to go to a possible early election. They're told you've got to be ready by August. What would be the upside of her calling an election based on those numbers? I mean, the only thing she would be thinking at that point is it's only going to get worse. I don't think anyone's going to make up their minds about an election call until after the HST referendum is in. But at the same time, that's not the kind of winning conditions when you have the opportunity to put off an election, unless you think there's something worse coming down the pipe.
Well, let's talk about some of the other elements around. We just had a session of the legislature, and we had two new leaders on display, the last week of it anyway. Both major parties have changed leaders in the last few months. We had Shane Simpson of the NDP on last week, and he ventured an NDP definition of the difference between our two new political leaders. Here's Shane Simpson.
There's quite a contrast. Adrian is a pretty thoughtful guy. He's always well read on any topic that he's dealing with. That's his style. People talk about Premier Clark as a good communicator, though maybe not quite as deep on some of those issues. So they bring very contrasting styles, I think, too, and we saw some of that, I think, beginning to reflect itself in the debate.
Were they adversaries for each other?
It is quite a dramatic difference. Although I always find when the NDP start characterizing Christy Clark as essentially superficial, I always wonder about that, because that really is the subtext. Adrian Dix is the guy of substance, and Christy Clark is not, right? And I always find when you start characterizing the woman on the podium as not having any depth, I just wonder if that rankles. I suspect a lot of women voters, at least, might find that a little bit offensive.
The flip side of that is an Adrian Dix whose scrums take forever, whose answers take forever, and Christy Clark, who does seem to be able to master the soundbite.
Adrian Dix I don't think he's a very good communicator. He struggles in media scrums. He gets combative and starts questioning almost the motives of anybody who asks him questions. If you don't agree with him, somehow you're in bed with the government, even though reporters just want to throw out questions to get his position on certain things. So I don't think that's one of his strong points. But Shane Simpson's right. Adrian Dix is very well briefed. He works very hard. We've all known him for years. He knows what he's talking about on a lot of issues. I think he is better briefed on a lot of issues than Christy Clark is. I think he's more of a policy person than Christy Clark. I like to joke with him that he's more like Gordon Campbell than Christy Clark is, because Campbell was a very much of a policy wonk as well as Adrian Dix is.
He loves that comparison.
Yeah, not really. But Clark is a formidable opponent, I think, for Adrian Dix, because she is so good in terms of the visual media, television. She communicates very well on the camera, and I think that's a big strength for her.
Here's Christy Clark defining the NDP, the Premier.
The NDP may be divided. They may be fighting amongst themselves. They may have dangerous ideas that would drag this province backwards, but as I said, they are hungry. They are hungry for power, and they are determined to beat us. They claim to be offering change, but we all know that the change they offer is really a U-turn backwards. We all know that where they would take us and our province and our economy is straight downhill. And that is not the change that British Columbia wants.
Can they get one more election out of this contrast based on the 90s and the last decade?
I don't know how many people still remember everything that went on in the 90s. And the NDP intended, the retort is it wasn't all bad. They point to economic growth numbers. So maybe it's a wash with a lot of voters out there. Christy Clark, though, I mean, she's almost at the point of socialist at the gates, which is W.A.C. Bennett's old line in the 60s, which was effective. But she's trying to demonize the NDP as a bunch of hard-line left-wingers. And I think Adrian Dix helps her do that to some point, but again, she's trying to paint them along lines that are more conducive to her, just as Adrian Dix and the Democrats are going to try to paint her as nothing more, Gordon Campbell basically in a dress. It's all about forming images of each other, and it's early days yet.
But, you know, if you look at the stands that Dix has taken so far, they don't fit that hard left.
No.
Well, actually, what I love is when she talks about this dangerous ideas of the NDP, and I'm thinking like raising the minimum wage,
which she did.
She did. Rolling back the last 3 corporate income tax cuts,
which she did.
Which she's promising to do as
restoring
long as
some of the gaming grants.
Yeah, you know, even when he talked about cosmetic pesticides, she said, "Hey, I'm all over that." She was begging the media to talk to her about how she agreed with the opposition on this one. So, what are the dangerous ideas? Well, the NDP is opposed to the HST, and she's not.
Yeah, well, that one, the jury is still out on. John Horgan, so the new NDP House Leader, is on the show, and he talked a little bit about the legislature session. So we got a couple of clips here from Horgan. Here's the first one.
We need to make the legislature relevant to people again, and I think that one of the challenges, and Shane touched upon this, is the fierce partisanship that we see with Christy Clark and Adrian, and the noise in the legislature, and I think you would agree, was louder than it had been in a long, long time. And I think the Speaker just basically let us play. Go ahead, you know, make your noise. If that's what you want to do, it's your house. Have at it. And I don't think that serves the public well.
Is it possible for it to be any different?
Well, it has been different. It was different under Gordon Campbell and Carol James. I mean, they both tried to bring a different era of cooperation and civility into that chamber. But I think we're seeing now a throwback to the old Socreds versus the NDP, where it was very bitter, very partisan. John Horgan's right, that last week when Christy Clark took her seat, you could not, I've never actually been in the chamber that many days where you could not, in question period, actually hear anybody. The din was so loud and so raucous and so continuous, and Bill Barasoff, the Speaker, I think he just threw in the towel and said, fine, scream at each other. But I don't think that particular discourse is relevant to the general population. I'm not sure, though, that what the solution is to make the legislature more relevant to the public. I think it's been a problem for years. I think there's a real disconnect between the public and what actually happens in the legislative chamber.
You got to go off and read Hansard to find out what the heck they actually said.
Sometimes you pull up the Blues an hour later, and they've got the microphones right there so they can actually record it. Now, the same thing is going on in the House of Commons, and you know, I remember Elizabeth May, when she won her seat, the first Green ever, she held a news conference and said she never even mentioned the environment. The first 20 minutes of her meeting with the media the day after she won, she talked about, I want to restore civility. I'm going to take my seat. I won't allow heckling when it's my turn to speak. And
she gets like one question a year.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, so people will talk about this, and then they get in there, and you know, I mean, I think part of what has changed in the chippiness of the House as well is we've got 2 House leaders now who are far chippier. And then the last pair we had
John Horgan up against
John
Rich
Horgan,
yeah.
and you know, and I think we're seeing less flexibility and less
Well, we're also seeing two leaders who are getting under each other's skin in a way that Campbell and James never did, in a way that Harcourt never did with who was opposing him. I think Glenn Clark and Gordon Campbell in a way had a bit of that going on, but there's a real personal animosity that exists between Adrian Dix and Christy Clark that's been absent from that legislative chamber for more than a decade.
Two very political people.
Political animals.
Very partisan political animals.
And ruthless.
Yeah. We will take a brief break on Voice of BC. Stay with us.
I don't think British Columbians are going to buy NDP math. He stands up and he talks about the billions of dollars. Will they believe the math from an opposition leader who produced 8 deficit budgets in a row? Will they believe an opposition leader who was there in the Premier's office when they raised taxes to the highest in Canada?
Your source for in-depth, local political coverage. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
Crime happens, but where it happens and who becomes the victim can be influenced by you and your community. As the eyes and ears of their neighborhoods, Block Watch programs assist police by reporting suspicious activity.
I'm witnessing a theft from a vehicle.
To learn more about crime prevention in your neighborhood, contact your local police department or the Block Watch Society of BC.
If you would like to contact us at Voice of BC, write to us. Our mailing address is 111 1925 Blanchard Street, Victoria, BC, V8T 4J2, or send us an email to vobc@shaw.ca.
What's your thing?
Bugs. My thing's sound effects. Here's a T-Rex.
Mom! Mom! Aiden cut me in half again!
Nobody's good at everything. Everybody's good at something. What's your thing?
And the House doesn't sit more than 4 days and 10 months. That's people in the political process disrespecting the work they themselves do. But that's worse for the NDP, I'd argue, than the Liberals, because we have more belief in and more optimism and more belief in the ability of us as a community to take action on things. So when the Liberals make politics more cynical, that's what people expect from that.
Welcome back to Voice of BC. Could we just deal with this issue of the legislature only sitting for 24 days this year? I don't think this year is typical, and in fact, if we have an election, it's entirely possible that whoever wins, the legislature will sit again this fall.
Yeah, I would think if there's an election, we'll come back in the fall. This was an unusual situation where both parties, through mutual agreement, basically got out of this place so they could run leadership races for months. Both of it were in marathon leadership races, which I think made this session a truncated session. Now, you could argue, though, the Liberals could have kept the House going if they brought in some legislation. There's no reason it had to end in June. I think the NDP's right to raise this as an issue, but it's an odd year.
Yeah. It's also, and I think Bill Thielman actually does know this, it's not like the MLAs do 24 days of work and then go home and go fishing. I mean, there's a lot of work that's done outside of the legislature. We just don't see it. We don't have that access, so we don't have the constant. I love it when they're here because I get to see them. I know where the Premier is usually most days. But to pretend that they don't actually work outside of the legislature is a bit silly.
Well, I mean, Tillman supported Adrian Dix, and I can assure you that when the House is not sitting, Adrian Dix is still working around the clock because he's a workaholic.
He works all the time.
So one of the things that did happen in that very short session was an embarrassment for Premier Christy Clark. She had one member of caucus support her for the leadership, and she put him in cabinet. And, well, let's just look at this exchange involving Harry Bloy. Here's Shane Simpson and Harry Bloy.
It's time for this minister to get a handle on his file. He's had this ministry for months. He's dealing with the most vulnerable people in this province, and he does not know what he's doing. That's the reality. It's time for the minister to speak for his ministry. He doesn't have his staff here to consult, to write the answers out. He doesn't have those people here. Will the minister stand up? Will he tell us whether he thinks that $20 is the best practice for dealing with emergency shelters?
You know, this ministry works very hard, and I'm proud of the work that this staff does to help individuals in our communities and working through Ministry of Social Development.
I keep telling people the Liberals, the New Democrats actually held back on Harry Bligh. They didn't go after him as hard as I've seen opposition parties go after weak ministers.
Adrian Dix told me when I expressed puzzlement why they didn't go after Bligh the next day. He said, "No, we're not going to make this a personal thing. You know, we made our point. He doesn't know the file. We're going to move on," which is interesting. It doesn't fit the stereotypical image of that place of it being as ruthless as it could have been. But it was a very embarrassing situation for the government. It exposed Bligh as the weakest minister in cabinet, the only one who supported Christy Clark, and you had to wonder. You look down the back bench, Dr. Maurice Stillwell, Dr. Margaret McDermott, a number of others who have either been in cabinet before or probably deserving a promotion, wondering why is Harry Bligh in there?
And this is one of the biggest ministries in government.
It's the third largest ministry. There's finance, there's education, and health. Well, health and education, and then social development are the three big spending ministries. In terms of power, it might not be the top one. But clearly, the Premier handed Harry Bligh a challenging ministry. He'd never been in cabinet, and I think we now know why. And yeah, I think for a caucus that's probably not entirely enthusiastic about the current setup and where the Premier's going on all things, there's probably a lot of tension on the backbench about people saying, well, you rewarded this guy because he backed you for the leadership. And he's an embarrassment. So it reflects on the Premier.
And I've heard that they put extraordinary resources into trying to get him up to speed.
Yes, no, he did perform, I think, better at the end of the session, marginally, than the disaster first couple of days were just brutal. I mean, you had Rich Coleman sitting on one side, Barry Penner sitting on the other side, in front of the public and the press gallery, pointing to Harry Bligh, say this. And you could actually hear Rich Coleman on the tape say this, you know, this is what you say. And it was unbelievable. I've never seen a performance like that where someone was so far out of their depth that that his colleagues thought it's better to embarrass him further by helping him rather than just let him flounder.
So the ballots have gone out, and Canada Post willing, they will eventually arrive, and you'll get a chance to vote. And this is going to be still one of the big political stories. It's been one of the biggest political stories for the last 2 years, to some degree or another. It's affected the careers of the leaders of both major parties, and it still goes on. So let's talk a little bit about this referendum, maybe not too much, and we'll use that as a lead into the election. Here she is, the leader of the Green Party, Jane Sturck.
Who do you think the HST referendum will hurt or help the most, the NDP or the Liberals?
Well, that's going to depend on the outcome of the vote. Obviously, you know, if Christy Clark and her government can pull off a victory here, that will be a major coup. I mean, just think of how many people were so inflamed about this issue, and still are extremely angry about the way her government brought in the harmonized sales tax. So if they've narrowed the gap, if they can pull it off, I think a lot of people will be saying, well, you know what, the fix that Christy Clark rolled out, she listened to us, she made some changes, and we believe her. I mean, that would be an incredible, I know we're going to talk about the election coming up, but that would be an incredible lead into that. The NDP have chosen to align themselves with the anti-HST, the yes side on this, and if it's extinguished, if people vote to extinguish the HST, then I think the NDP come out as having been on the side of the Angels.
Adrian Dix said on the show here, and I think it was a change from the position that Carol James took, he's determined to be associated as one of the leaders of the fight against the HST, whereas James, to a large degree, allowed Bill Vander Zalm to lead the fight.
She allowed Vander Zalm and Chris Delaney to be the front runners in that, and Dix is very much trying to put the NDP associated with getting rid of the HST. And Not surprisingly, the HST is unpopular, so why not be part of a movement to get rid of something that's unpopular? So Dix is taking a different course. Now, I agree with Justine. If the HST survives the referendum, I think that's a big win for the Liberals, or at least a big sigh of relief for the Liberals. If the HST goes down to defeat, as is expected, most people are expecting it to go down to defeat. I'm not sure that poll you had on, you showed the numbers 41-39. I'm not sure those numbers changed that much because of the HST going down. I still think it's going to be a very tight race in the next election campaign, no matter what the fate of the HST.
Do you think the timing of the election itself? Well, let's go to a Bill Tillman question and then ask this: the timing of the election. Here's Bill.
I used to work for a premier named Glenn Clark, who froze ferry fares, ICBC rates, hydro rates, increased the minimum wage. It looks like the second Premier Clark, Christy Clark, is doing a lot of the same. Do you think that means we're definitely into an election?
So do you think the outcome of the HST referendum determines whether or not we're going to get an election this fall?
I think it will be a big factor. If they win, then they probably are going to feel very buoyed and go into the fall saying, you know, we pulled this off, folks, let's rally and get going. Clearly, all the things that Bill just mentioned around the, tackling the ferry fares and BC Hydro rates, although they're not a fait accompli, she just said she wants to. But all those changes are lining things up so that she has the option to call the election. She's not going to call the election in the fall because she doesn't have to, unless she thinks she's going to win. So get everything ready, get all the stars aligned. If you pull this referendum off, great, you're in good shape. If you don't, then you can sit and think about, well, how do we position it? Do we have an election in the fall talking about the differences of how we're going to handle the fallout of the HST? I don't know.
Here, try the fallout question, though. I mean, in spite of the efforts, I would say, of the Van der Zandt forces to suggest that it's painless to kill the HST, there are consequences of getting rid of it, paying back the money to Ottawa, dealing with a hole in the budget. What does the government do about that? If they lose this vote, do they tell us what they're going to do to go back to the PST, or do they call an election?
Well, I guess that's one of the other options she's telling us. I agree with Justine that if they win this vote, I think that really lays the groundwork for a fall election. If they lose it, I think they have to take a step back. And I think they have to, the government's been so horrible on educating the public or trying to convince the public of anything associated with the HST or the budget. And I think they've got to spend some time, if the HST goes down, to make sure people are aware of the financial impact. As you mentioned, $1.6 billion. How fast is it paid back? What is the impact on the budget? Because that will also have an impact on whatever economic plan comes from Adrian Dix and the NDP. They've got to use the government's numbers to shape their own economic plan. And losing the HST is going to have an impact on that as well. So I think they need to buy time. Probably till the spring. And they'll probably further want to paint Adrian Dix image in a way that suits them. And I'm not sure. I just think right now Adrian Dix is not well known to the general public, and I think the Liberals want to make him well known.
We had Rich Coleman on the show, Government House Leader, Energy Minister, and also co-chair of the election campaign for the Liberals, the election readiness. And when he was on the show, Mr. Coleman pretty much defined what readiness means. Here's Rich Coleman.
If we went in the fall, it would have to be pre the municipal elections. So there's a limited window there. The Premier is not definitive about this at this point in time. So it's really about timing and whether we're ready and if the organization's ready to do it and how we get all that work done. So over the summer we'll be doing a lot of work to make sure we're ready, and then the opportunity comes that she wishes to go, she can go.
And ready is pretty much the end of August, mid-August.
Right, so they've got a whole bunch of things. You talked about money. My understanding is since Gordon Campbell stepped down, the people that usually bankroll the BC Liberal Party have stepped up. We saw their last financial report. They'd managed to dig themselves out of debt and have some money left over, so they're looking better financially in terms of mounting another election campaign. They've got to get through figuring out who's going to be running for them, and they've, but really what it's going to be about is putting together a campaign around Christy Clark, who is campaigning in a way against Gordon Campbell, and everything she's been doing since she won has been about saying, I'm taking these different steps, I'm not that guy that you're mad at, and I'm going to define myself in policy and in style as a different premier.
Now, you mentioned the question of candidates, nominations. This is something that drives incumbent members of the legislature nuts, is any discussion of this issue at all. So, of course, we're going to talk about it. And here, just to get us going on this, is Sean Holman. Here's Sean.
Do you think there is any way that Christy Clark can gently retire some of the MLAs in her caucus who don't support her or are a bit too long in the tooth without creating a division within the Liberals or boosting the support for the BC Conservatives by having some caucus members flee there?
So what do you think?
I think she has to tread very carefully on this. It depends if some Liberal MLAs want to continue on in politics. And if they do, Sean's right, maybe they want to bolt to the Conservative Party and inflict some damage on someone who's trying to deny them their political livelihood. So I think she has to be very careful. On the other hand, she may be able to convince some members of the caucus, and I don't think we're talking about a heck of a lot of people, but some members of the caucus, not buy them off, but say, why don't you think about stepping aside, and we can still work with you in private life, not necessarily with a job, but you're still going to be part of the government policy. But I think she's got to be very careful, because there are some MLAs, I think, out there who are not ready to be retired to pasture and want to continue on.
Clark told you that the Liberal Party does not have a history of protecting incumbents, which is not the way I would see it, but nevertheless, that's what she said.
Yeah, when we went up to the Liberal convention in Penticton, I had talked to the Premier and said, is it because I'd heard this rumor, it's open season on MLAs. In other words, people that already have a seat or are elected, generally, on the last 2 elections, have not been challenged for their nominations.
There's only been one case.
Yeah. So, as a general rule, that has been discouraged. And I talked to Kevin Kruger, who was the whip for caucus, and he was in charge of making sure that rule was in place. And he said, oh, no, it hasn't been open season and it won't be open season. So I say, well, the Premier's saying it is. So it's been left up to Rich Coleman to come up with a policy on how they're going to handle the incumbents and whether or not they'll have any protection. But given what the Premier said, I would think there's going to be quite a few people who are at the very least very nervous about whether they can hang on to their nominations.
Any speculation on who, if she had her way, she would like to see retire?
Well, again, it's speculation. It's in the rumor mill. John Van Dongen, I think, is already, someone's challenged, is about to challenge him.
A member of council out in Abbotsford,
Randy Hawes, maybe, Ian Black, maybe Kevin Kruger. No, there's no love lost there between her, but Kruger's
the 2 members in West Vancouver, I've heard, Ralph Sultan and Joan McIntyre both.
Will one of them be asked to step down? So Pamela Martin, maybe she wants to enter politics. So those are the names that I've heard. I'm not sure that necessarily means they're true, but certainly that's in the rumor mill.
Murray Cole here in Saanich is probably not going to run again, so that, and when a member decides not to run again, that makes it a lot easier.
No, absolutely, and I think what Christy Clark wants is, yes, she wants to bring in some new faces, and she also wants to be able to have some flexibility to offer some good, solid ridings to some star recruits, because you always want to come in and say, I'm renewing the party. Some of the safest seats are for instance, Colin Hanson. I don't know that, he said he's running again.
She's got her eye on that seat.
I think yes.
So safe seats are a premium.
Adrian Dix, when he was on the show, he's thrown out a provocative notion. And I don't know if the New Democrats have the resources to pull this off, but it would certainly shake things up politically. Here's Adrian Dix.
I think there should be no safe Liberal seat. I think we're recruiting candidates. We're encouraging people to run for nominations all over British Columbia. I think when you look at, for example, a region like the Okanagan, which I've visited many times as health critic, and you go from Salmon Arm to the border to the Boundary seat, Boundary-Similkameen seat.
So 7 seats.
7 seats. The NDP has lost them in every election since 1991, and that has to change. If you look east of Surrey, south of the Fraser, about the same number of seats, about 7 seats. You go 0 for 14 in those 2 regions of the province, and you're not going to win too many general elections.
So this is an interesting idea, because normally what happens in an election is they end up fighting over the same 20 seats, the 2 main parties. Once in a while they'll surprise each other, but basically they know where the battle lines are going to be drawn.
But when the polls are at 41-39, it does suggest both parties have safe seats. It's when one party implodes is when you see that dramatic shift of normally safe territory suddenly doing the unthinkable and going to another party. And we saw that in 91.
But didn't he show that, didn't Point Grey suggest a bit of a shake-up, the by-election?
Well, Point Grey I don't think was a safe Liberal seat. I would think, if I read Adrian right, some of these ridings, I mean, Bill Barasoff, I think, is not necessarily a safe seat in Penticton. Bill Barley held that seat for the NDP or in that area for some time. But some of those West Kelowna, some of those big Okanagan ones for Liberals, I don't think that's necessarily in play. I think it's more the swing, less safe seats that are vulnerable if there's enough swing in that vote, particularly if there's a bleed off to the Conservatives. That's the other thing that comes into play in the interior. Some seats that look safe for the Liberals suddenly are less safe and ready for the NDP to take if the Conservatives can take enough votes for them.
We have a question about the Conservatives, Justine. Here's your chance to answer it. Bernard Schulman.
The BC Conservatives have John Cummins as leader now, and he seems to be resonating very strongly with the hardcore old Reform Party types, social conservatives in this province. Do you think it's realistic that if an election is held that the BC Conservatives may win a significant number of rural seats in British Columbia? And does this mean we have the potential of seeing a minority government in BC after the next election?
Fun speculation.
Yeah, it's minority government, maybe not. But what we're talking about is whether or not there's enough weakness in the BC Liberals under Christy Clark where she can't hold together the coalition that Gordon Campbell held together, that they could sort of organize and pick off. And what that generally does is it doesn't create a third party very often in BC. What it does is it turns over those seats to the NDP. And I think that's why Adrian Dix is talking about targeting seats that are not typically described as swing seats, but going in and saying, well, where in rural British Columbia, for example, can we go in and capitalize on a shift on the BC Liberal base being undermined.
We'll talk about Christy Clark's strategy for dealing with John Cummins when we come back. Brief break with the media panel on Voice of BC. Stay with us.
The $6 million BC Rail plea bargain is, and I quote, not something I intend to reconsider. She further says, and I quote, is a decision that was made and is not something that I'll be revisiting. So funny how that is, Mr. Speaker. Funny how that is, Mr. Speaker. She was curious about the plea bargain when she was a talk show host. But now that she's Premier and has the power to do something about it, poof, that curiosity is gone.
Producing over 9,000 hours of local programming every year. This is Shaw TV, your local voice.
As I'm driving to work, I can feel the anxiety building. My stomach starts to get sick. I start to sweat.
It's a feeling of terror, like a life and death situation, basically.
I always feel like I'm, under a spotlight.
I would kill myself at a certain point if things didn't get better.
Anxiety and depressive disorders are the most common of all mental illnesses. For a free mental health screening, call our toll-free number or visit our website today.
Miss something on Voice of BC? Catch an encore presentation of this show on your local Shaw TV. If you live in the Lower Mainland, Voice of BC rebroadcasts Saturday morning at 10:30 and Sunday afternoon at 4. On Vancouver Island, watch Voice of BC Saturday at 10 a.m. or Sunday afternoon at 2. To find out when Voice of BC rebroadcasts in all other parts of the province, please contact your local Shaw TV or check the TV listings for your area.
Kidney disease affects an estimated 2 million Canadians. Many don't even know they have it. But thanks to the Kidney Foundation of Canada's innovative programs and vital research, countless people have been able to turn to us to help them manage, delay, and in some cases even prevent the disease. We're the Kidney Foundation of Canada. Please support us. We're behind you all the way.
Well, since the last election, the BC Liberals have raised the price of liquor to restaurants and bars. They've imposed the harmonized sales tax. They've imposed a stiff hike in the minimum wage. They've even stationed RCMP officers at the front door of restaurants and bars to make sure that none of their patrons inside have been drinking. I was surprised when the legislature adjourned without a formal declaration of war by the BC Liberals against the restaurant industry.
Next week we're going to do in Voice of BC, we're going to do a show on regional issues in British Columbia. And we've got Bernard von Schulman, who you've often seen on this show asking questions. Bernard knows that region pretty well, knows the regions of British Columbia well. And Bob Simpson, one of the remaining endangered independent members of the BC legislature, member for Caribou. So that'll be an interesting discussion. Tonight, I just wanted to come back briefly to you, Keith, and just talk about whether or not Christy Clark has any strategy we could point to for dealing with this thing that a lot of Liberals talk about, which is the threat of a revival of a separate Conservative Party.
Well, I thought we saw a glimmer of that at the Liberal convention when she sort of did a shout out in the crowd to retiring Conservative MPs like Stockwell Day, Jay Hill, Chuck Strahl, and she's, by playing that card, I think, and then getting them to reciprocate by saying we don't want the coalition to fall apart, we don't want the NDP in power here. I think that's her strategy, is to get that the establishment of the Conservative Party, like Stockwell Day, Chuck Strahl, and Jay Hill, to publicly back her. John Cummins was a maverick in the Conservative Party. He had no real constituency there. He was off on his own on a lot of issues, and I think that's part of his strategy, was to isolate John Cummins as a maverick and not as a leader.
Rich Coleman was on the show. One of the things we talked about is hydro. Justine mentioned this earlier. The, BC Hydro is a subject of review at the moment. The review is due, I believe, at the end of the month. 3 senior public servants are reviewing essentially why Hydro is proposing a 50% rate increase over 5 years and whether anything could be done about it. We got Coleman talking about some of the things that might be in that review. So let's start with the minister himself, Rich Coleman.
What the family's first agenda is the rate to the family in British Columbia. We want to make sure that we can run a good corporation, we have a sustainable company, we take care of the issues that we have with having to do upgrades and what have you, and new power. At the same time, do it in such a way that we're going to have the minimal impact on rates. And so if there are things, decisions that have been made that should be looked at and have a second look, they should during this review, and they will.
Any idea, with 2 weeks to go before the review is done, Justine, what they might change?
Well, first of all, he's taken a whole bunch of the big ticket items off the table. Site C wants to go ahead with it. Smart meters going to go ahead. Ruskin Dam, $850 million for a retrofit of an old dam, going to do that. So what is he left with? Well, he's talked about, and he talked about this on your show, maybe tinkering with our target, which is in 5 years from now, BC Hydro is supposed to be once again self-sufficient for energy. We're not supposed to be relying on imports for electricity, which we more or less have for the last 15 years. That's an extremely
stringent definition of self-sufficiency.
That's right, yeah.
Based on worst case scenario.
Well, worst case scenario based on going back to the 1940s. I'm not sure it's the actual worst case scenario. But so they're talking about tinkering with the definitions. So the government in legislation committed 5 years ago, we are going to be energy self-sufficient again. It sounds like a good, motherhood and apple pie kind of issue. We shouldn't be relying on energy imports to provide our electricity. Look what happened to California 10 years ago.
But right now, imported power is incredibly cheap.
It is right now.
The Americans are building natural gas everywhere. Right?
So right now, it doesn't look like such a bad idea to say, well, let's have some flex and save ourselves some money. I don't think the self-sufficiency is really part of that 50% rate hike. I don't think they've even started to factor that in, really. So I think they're still going to have to make some other changes somewhere. He's also talking about looking at how many people are working at BC Hydro, and some of the other things, how they actually go out and buy things, procurement. So there'll be some changes, but whether they're going to make the kind of impact that he wants to make, I'm not sure.
We're talking billions of dollars of upgrade and maintenance. This is not just tinkering with a few power lines here. There's the dam side, is Ruskin Dam, and all the other big ticket items.
Here, yeah.
There's also little things like telephone poles and transmission wires and the whole 9 yards. Hydro's been around for a long time, but just like so many parts of the country, and not just Canada, but everywhere, the infrastructure is aging. A lot of this stuff was built 50 years ago, and there's just a natural need to upgrade, whether it's hydro, which is going through its phase. We see bridge collapses in the United States because bridges have not been upgraded or maintained. They were built 50 years ago, and hydro's struggling with the same thing. I agree with Justine. I don't think at the end of this you're going to see a huge impact on the rates, because we're talking billions of dollars of expenditure and it has to be paid for some way.
Coleman, his first 24 hours on the job, suggested one of the things he was going to review was smart meters, but he fairly quickly turned around on that. When he was on the show, I asked him how they managed to persuade him so quickly that smart meters were such a Jim Dandy idea. Here's what Rich Coleman said.
All the way down the line, you have opportunities where you lose power, you know, basically on transmission, or you have a transformer go down, or whatever the case may be, and you need a system that can talk to itself. And the other piece about it is that, you know, if you have a windstorm or something, you can actually send people with the right equipment to the right location to fix it, which is safer for your employees and safer for, and a better reaction to the problem.
In a paranoid province, do people want their meters talking to hydro headquarters? I don't know.
Well, there is that criticism. I mean, people are convinced this is some sort of diabolical plot to monitor your
brainwaves.
Yes, brainwaves and electrical uses. I've heard both arguments on the one hand. I haven't heard a really great business plan, though, from Hydro, $1 billion expenditure or something, and this thing is supposed to have payoff, what, years
over
down the road?
15 years,
15
and they're
years.
also banking on huge amounts of, they're saying, well, there's all these grow-ops who are stealing electricity, and we're going to get these huge amounts of money in savings
they keep putting
from
different
that.
numbers out about that.
And so I think there's a lot of, I haven't seen the business case rolled out. I have talked to people who have seen it, and they say that it is worth looking at. But I think one of the things he didn't mention there is that they've already started investing in it. Yeah. They went out and put the contract out after the government first indicated there were some reservations. They went out and put the contract out. Now they say, well, we're in it. You know, we can't stop now.
If you saw John Horgan on the show last week, and he's not a fan of smart meters, that's pretty much what he said. That Hydro presented Coleman with a fait accompli. They signed the contracts.
No.
And so, and I think Horgan's probably right about that. The other thing that's interesting, and you both mentioned this grow-up issue and whether or not they can catch all this criminal activity. A colleague of mine at the Vancouver Sun has been trying to get Hydro's report, which was supposedly done by one of British Columbia's leading criminologists, that shows how much they can catch, and the report still hasn't been produced. We still can't get a copy of it, in spite of them saying, using it as a reason for going to smart meters. We have yet to see the report be made public, demonstrating how it will catch $100 million worth of grow-up.
No, what is on the record is what they said in some of their previous reports, where they said it was a fraction of what they're now claiming.
Right. The numbers keep changing on that one.
Well, we don't have time to do too much on this issue, but it is there, especially if you listen to some of the radio ads on this one. You're hearing now the Teachers Union is out advertising about the fact that it's in talks with the government and that it expects to get a raise this year, and it expects to get compensated too for a government law of a few years ago that broke the teachers' contract, a law that was brought in while Christy Clark was Education Minister. So let's go to a question about, are we headed for a teacher strike? How the labor dispute is going with teachers. Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Gregory Thomas. Here's Gregory.
Well, we might be looking at a teacher strike in the fall. And I was wondering how the BC Teachers Federation, with a $17 billion pension fund, most of it invested in offshore corporations, stands to come out as the party that needs more money when the BC government is now $50 billion in debt.
They made a pretty strong case for a raise.
And the other thing is this court ruling, right? What the government hasn't yet dealt with. They've basically been given a year by the courts to deal with the fact that the law that they brought in, which effectively capped the size and the makeup of classes, what the impact is, because that was an unlawful law according to under the Constitution. So that's hanging over the government. George Abbott, the minister, has really made an effort to try and bring down the level of acrimony with the teachers, and he's talking about things that are non-monetary. He's talking about professional development and giving teachers more autonomy. I think that'll go some way to making teachers happier about the workplace, but at the same time, it's been a long time since they've had a raise, and the dynamics are pretty tough.
Yeah, I don't think you're going to see a strike in the fall, though. I think you're going to see job action. We've seen the pattern before with BCTF. First thing is withdrawing from coaching duties or extra work in the classroom. So that gradually increases the pressure on the employer. Parents start to get angry about this. That'll build through the fall. I don't think they want to run into the school board elections, which are also in the fall. So I think you're more looking at possibly a spring-like window for a strike by the BCTF. But I don't see a wage increase coming for them. But I do think And Susan Lampert, the president, made this very clear at the convention we went to here in Victoria, is the #1 issue for the BCTF and the teachers is class composition and class size. And that's what you hear from teachers, when I hear from teachers, more than their salaries. And I think that's, if there's a settlement here, I'm not sure there will be one, but I think if the government moves on that, that will appease some of the anger.
A couple of media questions, if we can get through them before we run out of time. Sean Holman, here he is.
Over the past 8 years, I've noticed that we in the media don't talk to the public much about the challenges that we face reporting on government, especially in comparison to our colleagues down in the States, where they have much more access to public record information than we do. And we often say to ourselves that they're not interested in that kind of stuff, that it's just inside baseball and we're whining if we do report on it. But I'm wondering, given the lack of confidence that is currently in the Canadian media, whether or not that's a mistake.
What do you think, Justine?
I think actually, I do think that the public would see us as whining if we complained about access and the working conditions. And you know, I was looking at an interesting piece on social media and how we are now expected not just to file to our respective newspapers or broadcasters, but to tweet and to do all these other additional things, blogging and uploading video and everything. And the response from some of the public was, stop whining.
Yeah.
This is the reality. Be happy you got a job.
When there was some journalists complained when BC Ferries was charging journalists. This is awful. I noticed on some of the blogs, left-wing sites and blogs, the reaction was not, "Oh, this is terrible for the media." It's like, so what? You know, do your job. Quit complaining. So I think the last part of Sean's comments, right? The public would just see us as a bunch of whiners if we were to complain.
Jim Sinclair has a question about the Tyee. Here's Jim.
We hear a lot of talk about corporate concentration in the media, and there's no question over my lifetime it's grown a lot, as it has in yours. One of the alternative media in British Columbia is called the Tyee. It was founded by the Labour movement and others to create an alternative voice to that corporate media. Do you think it's been a success, and do you think it's contributed positively to people's outlook in British Columbia?
And if you watch us regularly, you'll often see Andrew McLeod from the Tyee asks a lot of the questions on this show now. What do you think?
Well, I think it makes a positive contribution. I mean, you know, I think they generate some good stories. It's obviously from an ideological perspective. It's not an objective news source, but I think it plays to people, caters to people who already believe a set of beliefs and want to see those reinforced. And that's why its audience, I don't think, will ever be that big. It will never compete.
Andrew breaks a lot of news
Andrew
stories
McLeod's
too.
a very good reporter, and they've got other good people writing for them, but it's a very ideological point of view, which is fine, but in terms of having an impact, doesn't have the impact the Vancouver Sun or the Globe or Global or CBC has. I mean, the audience for those outlets are just so much bigger than we'll ever get with that particular.
But
they do good stories.
Any diversity, though, in the media is
good.
Healthy. You know, when I first started in the press gallery, you guys were there. I had to fight to get a desk in the legislature, and that was a few years ago. Yeah, that was the last desk, and I had to prove I was going to be there every day. And now you go up, and there's lots of room up there. There's you know, so there aren't as many voices, and anything. Yeah.
What's your call on whether or not there's going to be a fall election?
I am going to wait and see what happens on the HST, but I would say the HST looks like it's going down. I think maybe not so much.
I was really thinking it was going to be the fall. I'm now starting to think it may be the spring.
The opportunity to run as a fresh face has perhaps already passed the Premier?
Yeah,
she's going to have to work for it?
I still think she's running ahead of her party with the public, but I think she's got to come across more as a Premier and do more things like that, and I think they've got to do more to paint Adrian Dix as an alternative people don't want.
Well, I think unless they can close the gap on the HST, and they might be able to. It's not over on that certainly yet. I think a fall election is unlikely, although for a long time, like you, I thought we were going to see an election middle of September. Thank you to Justine Hunter for being on Voice of BC tonight. Thank you, Keith Baldrey. Thanks to the media panel. Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature BC politics into your living room. Next week, we're going to have a look at issues involving rural British Columbia with Bob Simpson and Bernard Von Schulman. Thank you for watching Voice of BC. Good night.